Imam stood in the square under the torchlight. People pushed and shouted. Smoke mixed with the cold night. A child kicked a big cucumber that had grown strange and heavy. The cucumber split open. A small black scrap of paper fell out. On it was one word, hunger. The scrap moved as if it breathed. A tiny green root slipped from the paper and bristled. The crowd quieted. The air felt thin and full of waiting. Imam felt her heart beat fast. She remembered the fields, the long furrows, and how the vines had begun to act like animals that learned tricks. A boy held the scrap and the root touched his palm. He shivered and whispered a song he could not explain. His grandmother sat nearby and cried because the boy sang a lullaby she had never taught him. People looked at each other and felt the strange thing settle into them like a question. Imam wanted to speak, to tell them what she had seen in the fields, how vines moved when the tonic was poured, how leaves bent like ears. But the crowd had its own fear. They turned on one another, seeking blame. Imam clutched the torn basket at her side and watched the green root curl. A small voice in the square said, "Look." All of them looked. None of them yet understood the price of the sweetness. Akpan came on a dusty road with a small glowing bottle tied to his neck. He was thin and moved quietly. He set his bag down in the market and told the people about seeds that listened. He showed a drop of the tonic and said, "This will make food sweet and big. It will help your families." The mayor and the bakers watched. Akpan planted a seed in a pot on the mayor's table and poured a drop of the tonic. By morning a cucumber grew large and tasted like a warm kitchen. People cheered. They bought the tonic with coins and with small favors. The village had long hard months. The tonic felt like a bright answer. Imam watched from a shaded lane. She saw the way Akpan held the bottle like a treasure. She saw how flies avoided his shadow. She noticed something quiet. Some hands in the crowd had tiny marks like seed prints. They pulsed softly as if alive. She thought of the boy with the scrap of paper and the lullaby his grandmother did not know. The next market day more food grew quick and strange. A baker cut a slice and a child in the crowd called his grandmother's name, then hummed a tune the grandmother did not teach. Imam felt fear like cold rain. She wanted to tell them to stop, but people wanted to taste the good things. The village praised Akpan and called it luck. Imam knew the soil. She had worked in the field since she was small. To her, the ground was like a map of secrets and habits. When the tonic began to be used everywhere, she felt uneasy. The next morning she went to the council. The mayor sat with his bright sleeve, and the baker with flour under his nails. Imam told them what she had seen, how Akpan's tonic made memories slip and how some hands now had tiny seed marks. The leaders smiled and offered her a garland as if she had been silly. They asked her to be patient and promised a share of the harvest. Imam left the hall with mud on her boots. She walked past the fields where the vines bowed and listened as if to a voice. A tendril moved and curled around her ankle like a living thread. At dusk the vine hummed and what came back to her was a lullaby. It was her mother's song, but somehow wrong. It named a child that did not yet exist. Imam felt a pang as if a ledger had written her name across her skin. She could not make the council see. People wanted easy answers and full plates. Imam held her hands open and tried to hold that small wrong song close, while the village celebrated without knowing what the tonic cost. At first the odd things were easy to call luck. A fisherman pulled a cucumber that dripped silver water. A baker found tiny humming seeds in his flour sack and laughed at a strange gift. The village smiled and called it fortune. But Imam kept waking to small problems. Mud on a doorstep. A pair of shoes by the hearth though no child had walked there at night. She watched people sleep and saw seed marks on some palms. These tiny marks pulsed like a heartbeat under the skin. When she pressed one, it blinked and shifted into an arrow that pointed toward the marsh. She showed Nsika the mark. He stopped kneading dough and stared. In the fog that morning, a trail of wet footprints led from the swamp to the square. Some prints looked small and curved, not quite human. Imam began to feel that the strange joy had a cost. The village tasted sweetness, but tiny things were leaving. She wanted to find the cause before it was too late. She knew now the tonic could change more than plants. It could make the land take things that were hard to get back. Night was thick when Imam slipped toward Akpan's camp by the old mill. The vial sat warm in the straw like a small caught star. When she held it, something moved inside as if it were alive. Small dark specks shifted and a sound like a sigh came out. A twig snapped underfoot. Akpan stepped from the shadows. He was not angry. He sounded tired. He looked at Imam and said softly, "You kept one." His voice held a strange relief. Imam ran with the vial hidden under her shawl. On the wooden bridge, she saw a smear of green on her palm that would not wash away. It pulsed when she tried to think of a neighbor's name. The smear opened into a tiny rune that twitched and then fell quiet. Back in her room, Imam turned the vial in her hands. The tiny things inside seemed to hold names. She wrapped the bottle and wondered how many lives and stories the village had given for sweet food. Her heart beat in a new fear. If the tonic could hold memories, what else could it hold? What did the marsh want in return? Market smelled of bread and gossip. Imam moved through stalls with the vial pressed to her chest. She bought a prize cucumber and took it to Nsika's shop. When the knife cut the skin, she found a small carved rune at the center. Inside the rune sat a tiny kernel shaped like a curled child. When Imam touched the kernel, a sound came from it, a low memory like stone rubbing stone. An image flashed in her head, a winter where the river demanded names for thaw. Imam felt wrong, as though a part of her fit into the memory but did not belong. The rune seared into the back of her hand like a cold pen. A private memory of her mother slipped free and drifted away like a leaf. The rune spoke in a tiny voice, "Keep the book." Imam felt the ledger work. Her palm grew a new line of letters, one that spelled a name she did not yet know. She realized the tonic did not give without asking. It kept a tally. Woods and water had always taken their share, but now the tally had names and futures attached. At dusk Imam went to Sada's hut. The midwife's house smelled of herbs and warm clay. Jars lined the shelves, some held tiny things like breaths. Itoro listened and did not look surprised. Imam placed the vial, the kernel, and the carved shard on the table. Itoro traced the marks with careful fingers. She told a quiet story. Long ago in drought, the swamp made a bargain. It gave harvests but took names and future promises. People called the deal relief. The swamp kept its account in a seed stone and in jars. Itoro gave Imam a torn map and pointed to an inlet by an old stump. She wrapped a reed charm around Imam's wrist and warned, "You can pull a debt back, but it costs. The marsh asks for balance." Outside the drums began. The mayor announced a festival for Akpan. The crinkle of the map's ink grew dark, like it decided on a direction. Imam felt the weight of the choice settle in her bones. She would have to follow the mark if she wanted to save the village. Dawn was thin and cold when Imam, Nsika, and Kunnel followed Akpan. The cart rolled slow, covered in burlap. Its scent was sweet like syrup and old like smoke. They walked at a distance so the cart would not see them. Under a seat they found a small hidden book. It was leather and soft from hands. The pages were lists of names with numbers beside them. Many lines had the word given. Imam's hands shook as she read the neat entries. One name glowed fresh on the paper, Val. The ink looked wet as if it had been written moments ago. They watched the jars on the cart. Each hummed like it kept a quiet sound. Nsika, curious, tasted a spoon from one jar. His face changed. He sang a memory that was not his and could not stop. Kunnel slammed the lid, and the jar hummed on beneath the wax like a trapped song. A muffled movement came from under a burlap sack. Something pushed. A small pale hand pressed against the cloth, wanting freedom. Imam understood then the truth. The tonic in the jars held things people loved, and someone had paid for them in a way they did not fully know. They stayed hidden and watched the cart as it moved toward the fair. The jars glowed faintly in the morning light. At one stop, Akpan smiled and gave jars away for praise and coins. People took the sweet food and cheered. Under the cart, the sack twitched again. Imam could not stand it. She pulled the cloth aside. Inside, wrapped in straw, was a small pale creature the shape of a child. Its skin had small green veins like young leaves. It blinked and made a soft sound. Akpan came and stood with them, and his face was not mean but tired. He spoke in a small voice and said he had been the middleman for a pact the village had made long ago. The jars and seeds stored memories for the swamp. Given meant the swamp kept a life's worth for itself. When Akpan showed them his throat, a thin glossy root ran under his skin. He told how he had traded his name for the job. His voice shook as he untied the sack. The small thing inside stretched and, for the first time, tried to say a name. The name it made was Nsika, and the baker went white as if the name had taken something out of him. Hidden under a hedgerow with dawn mist around them, they opened the leather book. The pages showed names in rows with columns of numbers. The word given stood in a pale column that meant final. One entry read Elderayani, bound. Imam felt cold. They found Aini later at the river, her hands cupped and empty. She looked at them without the usual warmth. Aini could not remember the year she was born. She named fish she had never seen. Imam saw the same tiny mark on Aini's skin. The ledger seemed to be an account book for lives. How many jars made a childhood? How many jars made a promise? Imam realized the tonic and the jars were not magic without cost. They were part of a trade the village had accepted. They carried the ledger and the strange small thing they had freed. The pages were heavy with names and the slow weight of choices. Imam's fear changed into a hard purpose. She knew they needed Sada's knowledge and a plan to return what had been taken. Imam slept with the ledger and the map near her. The map Itoro had given her had a dark mark by an old stump. One night the ink moved a little as if deciding. The word return showed up in fresh ink under the stump. Imam touched the map and felt it pulse like a small heart. She pressed her palm to the paper and the rune on the ledger answered. The mark on her hand had learned to speak. She took Sada's bone needle and its black thread. Some things needed to be stitched back. Outside, drums boomed in the square. The festival for Akpan was loud. Imam felt the choice like a cold stone. She could let the jars stay and the village keep its easy food, or she could try to return what had been taken. Her hands were small but steady. With the map and the ledger, Imam decided she would try to fix the trade. Akpan waited at the reed line like a man at the edge of a long road. He told a story that sounded like an apology. He said he had been given a role long ago, to keep the accounts between the swamp and the village. He had a small neutralizer seed and offered it like amends. Tomas, known Sika, took the seed and meant to bury it safe. When the seed opened in his palm, a vine lashed out and wrapped his wrist. Nsika fell and smiled as if a part of his mind had been watered by someone else. Akpan did not pull him free. He only showed the two of them the sack and said the trade was older than the village's memory. From the sack they could hear the small thing stir in a hand push. Akpan's eyes were full of regret. He showed them a glossy root under his own skin where a name had been taken. He said he had traded his name to become the broker. Imam felt a strange mix, anger, pity, and the steady need to fix what the trade had broken. Akpan spoke like a man unrolling a long list. He told them the jars were made to hold what the swamp wanted. Memories, songs, and names. He had been the middleman, a keeper of accounts. He opened a burlap sack slowly. Inside on straw lay a small pale creature. It made soft sounds like someone learning to speak. The villagers listened, their faces changing from anger to sorrow to fear. Akpan told them he had once been whole, but years ago he had traded his own name to keep the job. He pulled up his collar and showed a thin root under his skin. It looked like a small green vein. The little thing on the straw pushed a coil of vine and lifted its head. It tried to say a word. When it formed the sound, Nsika the baker went pale. The sound the creature made was Nsika's name. In that tiny cry, the baker felt like something had slipped away. The people realized the jars kept lives and futures in a ledger they never saw. Itoro brought a pouch of reed mud and told them how it worked. The mud smelled of iron and peat. It confuses the plant sense, she said, makes the vines think the weather is different. They walked to the marsh and the air felt heavy. Nsika had a green cord around his wrist from where the vine had gripped him. The mud was wet and cold. Imam rubbed it into the tendril on his arm. The vine loosened and recoiled as if it had smelled salt. Nsika fell into the grass like someone waking from a deep sleep. He was back but not the same. Sometimes his eyes were right and sometimes they held another person's memory. He kept asking for the heart, a word he could not finish. They grabbed what they could, a half-split totem, a seed shard, and the small creature from the sack. They ran across the bridge while the marsh watched. Behind them the shard in Imam's pocket pulsed. A thin green line cracked down the shard as if something inside was waking. The marsh answered with a low sound like water rolling over stones. The path ahead felt dangerous, but the village had to keep what it had. Imam's fear hardened into a plan. Back at Sada's table the seed shard sat under the lamp. Itoro turned it and read the carved marks. Each mark meant something, a name, a stolen memory, a future promised. The shard was not just a stone, it was a small book of bargains. When Itoro pressed her finger to the shard, the runes rearranged. Names lit up like coins. Some were scratched out. Some glowed like unpaid debts. A line formed in handwriting Imam knew, do not feed him the lullaby. The shard hummed and a thin rune in Imam's hand warmed as if waiting. Itoro said the ritual could make vines let go, but it would cost a memory. You must give willingly, she said. The swamp asks for balance. Imam felt the rune throb. She thought of her mother's lullaby, the small song that braided her days and made nights soft. It sat in her like a warm coin. If she offered it, would the swamp return what it had taken? The rune spelled a small syllable Imam did not know. Her choice would be heavy, but she had already seen what leaving the jars would do to their people. The festival filled the square with music and hot food. Lanterns swung and children ran with cucumbers like prizes. Imam stood with Itoro and 3 other quiet people. They had come to give what the shard asked for. Itoro wound willow wax around a small bone needle and threaded it through Imam's palm. The rune pulsed. Give willingly, Itoro told her. The swamp takes what is offered, not what is stolen. Imam thought of the lullaby her mother had sung. She held the tune inside like a candle. Her voice sounded small among the music. She sang one line of the lullaby and then let it go. Itoro pressed the needle to the shard. The runes flared and drank the sound. Immediately, vines that had wrapped jars began to shrink. Wax cracked and jars sighed as if released. People cheered and cried. Nsika laughed again, a ragged but true sound. The pale creature pushed from the burlap and blinked in the sunlight. Imam felt a hollow where the lullaby had been. She tried to hum and the song had gone. On her palm a tiny green shoot uncurled and wrapped around her finger like a promise. It tapped toward the marsh. Imam had closed one page, but another line was already being written. The village danced, but Imam stood at the edge with the sprout coiled on her finger. Joy mixed with sorrow. People were glad for what had returned, but some looked at Imam with questions. Itoro read the sprout like a map. It points, she said. Not a demand but a direction. You untied one knot and the swamp called for the next stitch. The ledger between them had new ink. A name circled and underlined, Vel. Imam pressed the place where the lullaby had lived and felt only a cool empty space. The sprout tapped twice, once toward the reeds, once toward the hollow where her heart tightened at the thought of a future family. It was not mean. It was a summons. Imam folded around the small empty feeling and found a new resolve. She would go to the marsh. She would follow the sprout and find what the ledger had written. The tendril on her palm uncurled and became a thin green thread that glowed faintly. It marked the first step on a path Imam had not known she would walk. They left before dawn. Itoro tied a reed charm to Imam's neck and Kunnel carried a shovel. The sprout on Imam's hand pulsed and leaned like a compass needle toward the reed line. Their boots sank in mud. At the hollow the air smelled of iron and old water. The sprout stopped and pointed straight down. Half buried in peat was a jar sealed with wax. On the lid a scrap of leather had a name, Vel. Below it someone had written given. The jar hummed like a small throat. Imam knelt and placed her hand on the glass. It fogged with breath that was not hers. Something inside tapped back in a small human rhythm. Kunnel's lantern light made the wax look like skin. Itoro whispered a knot chant and Imam pressed the bone needle but found no lullaby left to trade. A hairline crack ran along the wax and a tiny damp face pressed to the glass. It mouthed one syllable, Vel. Even before Imam could speak, she knew the name. The swamp had kept it safe but at a price. They opened the jar in a hush. When the lid came away, cold peat air breathed out. Inside, Vel was smaller than a child should be. Skin looked pale with thin green lines. Hair fell in glossy threads like wet reeds. Eyes were wide and clear. Vel's voice was soft and a little rough from being kept. Imam lifted the small body and wrapped it in a spare cloth. Vel whispered images. Jars on shelves, ink on paper, hands counting tallies. One memory pulled clear like a rag, a ledger column titled Future. In a cramped hand a line read, Imam's child, due, given. Imam felt the sprout on her palm burn and prick her. A new rune formed and sank into her skin like a cold knot. It spelled a word that felt like a promise tied tight. Bound. Vel looked up with a hunger to learn names and to belong. Imam thought she had nothing left to give. But the ledger had already written the next cost. Everyone held their breath. The swamp's account had reached past the past into the futures. The village did not dance. People hovered near the square, unsure if they were grateful or afraid. Vel clung to Imam's sleeve like a frightened bird. Faces that had laughed earlier looked tired and billowed as if the jars carried more than taste. Itoro read the new rune and said, They mark where they can reach. Your name is on the ledger now. Freeing Vel made a space and the swamp filled it. The pledge will pull until the account is closed. Imam felt a hard cold in her mouth. The ledger had made futures into columns and marks. She thought of the lullaby she had given and of names she had once sung to the moon. The sprout on her hand pulsed and pointed again toward the inlet by the old stump. Itoro said the seed stone at the stump kept the account. If Imam wanted the ledger closed, they must go to the stump and find the stone. They packed what they could. The shard, the ledger, Vel wrapped warm, sawdust charms, a shovel and the bone needle. The march into the marsh felt like walking into a listening place. The reeds leaned in as if to hear what they planned to do next. At low tide they reached the willow stump by the inlet. Iron rings circled the old wood. Gouges marked years of tallying. Fresh sap had bled, staining the peat red-brown. A new cut shone wet. Imam's breath stopped. The new gouge spelled her name. She reached out with shaking fingers. Before she could touch it, a sound came from the reeds. Akpan stepped into the light. His hands were empty and his smile was small. He said, "You were not supposed to find that line yet." Silence laid over them like wet cloth. Kunnel's lantern flickered. Nsika pressed his palm to his mouth. Vel nestled against Imam and made a soft wanting sound. The ledger had already written Imam, bound, due, 1 moon. Itoro said the swamp liked tidy things. It could file a future away as easily as a single name. Imam felt the rune on her palm flare hot. The seed stone in the hollow thrummed. The ledger's nib seemed to move on its own and a fresh line crawled across the paper. Imam watched the letters appear and felt both fear and a strange calm. She had chosen this path. The stump bore her name. The marsh called and Imam would answer. They worked when the tide was low and dove into a pocket under old pilings. Roots nodded like hands. There, half buried in mud, lay the seed stone. It was shaped like a dark egg, carved with rings and lines. When Imam touched the stone it hummed. Names and marks lit in its skin. Some letters were whole, others had been gouged away. The stone opened like a shell and inside was a small hollow. When they pried at it, water rose around their knees and the reeds stitched together. A deep voice came from the marsh, not from air but through the wet ground. The stone cracked and something long and green began to move beneath the water. A heart of vines, wide as a cartwheel, slowly unfolded and pushed toward the bank. The marsh called names. The vine heart unrolled a green ribbon and moved up the lane. As it passed, house lamps dimmed and small memories slipped like smoke through open windows. Imam felt the price rising. The seed stone had answers, but those answers moved like a tide and took what it needed to be full. Vel spoke in voices that sounded like river stone and mud. The small one told them what Akpan had not. The cucumbers were not simple fruit. They were vessels grown to hold human worth so the swamp could turn names into root children. Akpan the broker had only been the keeper. He had traded his name long ago to hold the accounts. He had helped the village in droughts, but the swamp wanted tidy payments. Names, futures, and youth kept until it could turn them into something that fit the land. Akpan with a shaking hand showed a glossy root under his own skin. He wept because he had to keep the ledger and sometimes had no choice. The seed stone cracked and from it a large vine heart began moving up the lane. It dragged a long green ribbon that took memories from each house it passed. Imam felt anger and sorrow. The vine heart was not simply hungry. It followed the ledger. If they did not close the accounts it would keep taking. Imam held Vel and thought of how to stop the slow hunger. The vine heart reached the lane and the village felt each step like a loss. Laughter grew thin, drawings on walls blurred and small things slipped away. Vel reached for what could become a promise. The vine fed on what could be named in the future. Imam realized the only thing the vine could not take was something blank. A future that could not be promised. Sada's ritual needed a terrible offering. Not a memory but a blanking of the right to give a future away. Imam thought of cost and meaning. She did not see it as losing love. She saw it as making a field safe. She chose to let her name be marked in the ledger so the vine would stop taking other people's children. But she also chose to stay and care for Vel and the village's children. The vines tasted the blank and hesitated. Slowly the vine heart shrank and withered like fruit left to fall. When it fell, a thin green sprout pushed from Imam's palm. It trembled like a small hope that had changed. The village had saved its past and its people, and Imam chose to shape her future by care, not absence. The marsh sank back and the seed stone slid under dark water. Akpan stayed but his role changed. The jars became plain and the cucumbers returned to normal size. The villagers were free but not all pieces fit as before. Some memories did not come back. Places and laughter were quiet patches. They tore the ledger and burned what they could. Ash lay underfoot like a slow reminder. Imam had given a promise of her name to stop the vine. She did not think of it as losing her whole life. She stayed in the village, caring for Vel and for the other children. The people promised to be careful and to share their homes and love. Imam kept the small green sprout in a wooden bowl on her window. It trembled and showed her that choices change the future. She sat in the square where the scrap had once breathed hunger. She whispered, not a wish but a lesson, we will watch what sweetness asks of us. The sprout shivered once like an answer.